Hi, my name is Andrea Ortiz. I'm a student in Tech Millennium and I'm going to be doing a presentation on the Cold War. General description. What was the Cold War? Basically, the Cold War was a political conflict that began at the end of the 40s, and even though some consider that it ended in 1977, it actually kept running up until 1991. In this period, the conflict happened between the United States and the USSR, also known as the Soviet Union, two nations that were considered world superpowers after World War II ended in 1945. This conflict began a division between economic systems, which were capitalism and communism. Some important dates during this conflict were June 5, 1947, Marshall Plan. The US wanted to provide aid to any European country that needed it, but Stalin didn't approve it, and it caused a lot of tension between both nations. On June 24, 1948, there was a blockade in Berlin. When West Germany merged, the USSR blocked all transport links, so there were no resources for Western citizens. On May 14, 1955, the Warsaw Pact was made. This was a treaty among the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, Albania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Poland, and Romania that established a mutual defense between them. On October 14, 1962, the Soviet Union started to install missiles in Cuba illegally. On May 26, 1972, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty was made between the US and the Soviet Union to control weapons used to defend certain areas in Europe. On December 3, 1989, there was a meeting between Bush and Gorbachev that reversed factors that had started misunderstandings between both nations, and this was considered the beginning of the end of the Cold War. Now, the term Cold War. Where did it come from? This conflict was named this way because, unlike the typical fights between nations, the United States and the Soviet Union never engaged in an actual hot fight with soldiers in a battlefield. It was a Cold War because it was mainly a political fight in which each country would respond to the actions of the other, but they never physically fought directly with each other. The economic systems were capitalism and socialism. Capitalism had to do with the economy of society being controlled by private individuals or corporations that own means of production and they get a profit out of them. There's very little interference from the government in production and trade. There's high competition in the market between owners of means in order to get more profit, and demand is important to consider. Goal is to maximize profit and minimize cost. And the first person to mention capitalist ideas for the well-being of society and distribution of means was Adam Smith. Other important figures on capitalism were Frederick Stang, Joshua Reynolds, and Johann August. Now, socialism. Socialism has to do with the economy of society being controlled by the government, and it's considered owner of all economic activities. The government decides everything, including prices and the means it puts out. There's very low competition in the market since the government takes decisions for everyone, and the profit is divided between everyone equally. The goal is to create a cooperative economy and distribute resources according to the work done by every individual. And the idea rises thanks to Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who distinguished the class struggle and inequality. Now, I'm going to present the interview I made. I interviewed Sirawan Ortiz. He's 62 years old and he's my dad. The first question was, what countries were the world leaders during this period? His answer was, I think that the most important countries during the Cold War were what's now Russia, but back then was known as the Soviet Union and the United States. Some other countries from Europe were involved, but not as much. The second question was, why did countries that were allies during the wars become enemies afterwards? And his answer was, probably because during wars they had a common interest in mind to stop someone else, but once a country sees how strong another is, mistrust could arise and they might start questioning if that country won't be a problem in the future. These doubts could lead into wanting to intervene before it becomes a possibility, apart from the fact that countries always have different points of view on political and economic stuff, which could lead to misunderstandings and make tension rise between them. The third question was, where did the Cold War take place? And his answer was, there wasn't a specific place since it wasn't a physical war, but since the conflict went back and forth between the US and the Soviet Union, you can consider them as where it took place. The fourth question was, what opinion did the general public have of the Cold War? And his answer was, they were all tense and scared during all of it because they feared this Cold War could unleash as a third world war. Even people here in Mexico were afraid because we didn't know what to expect from that conflict. And the final question was, what type of weapons did the two world powers have at their disposal? And his answer was, well, both nations had nuclear weapons and bombs, but they also used satellites as a weapon because they used them to spy on the other and interrupt signals. During this period, they also developed more chemical weapons that weren't used as often but magnified the intensity of bombs. And my conclusion is, even though it was a very tense period for everyone and lots of bad decisions were made, like the Berlin Wall, I think it could have been way worse. Since there wasn't any physical fighting, not many people died in comparison to other wars like World War II, and many technological advances were done, so it wasn't as bad as it could have been. The first people that went to space and the first satellites were consequences of this conflict, among many others, so there's also a good side to it. Still, I think it must have been horrible for people to fear every day if there will be a third world war, and it makes me reflect on the fact that it still could happen with the tension between certain nations nowadays. And when it comes to the economic, very different things that are supposed to guarantee the well-being of society, but sometimes it doesn't work as well as it should. For example, capitalism is great because it promotes individual rights, but it also causes the prices in the market to go up because of the demand. And socialism seeks equality between everyone, but there's not much freedom to gain the profit you deserve since the government controls ups and downs depending on how their capitalism works better.